is the not very felicitous John underscore L underscore Metz. So that's a little bit difficult. But how about the Athenai Institute? How do they find that?
So Athenai is on Twitter at Athenai Inst, all one word. So the institute is cut off. You can also find us at our website, which is www.athenai.org.
That's very easy, athenai.org. Now, John, when you appealed to people to divest, does it mean no stocks at all out of China? How do you identify a CCP government entity?
Well, there are a few different rungs on the ladder of divestment for us. First of all, we're calling on universities to divest any direct holdings in companies that are tied to the Chinese government or complicit in its human rights abuses. But we're also calling for universities to reduce their exposure to China in other ways. That includes any kind of financial entanglement from passive investments in index funds and mutual funds that are heavily exposed to China. It includes research partnerships that in many cases don't have the necessary guardrails in place to ensure that they're not putting technology in the wrong hands, in the hands of the Chinese government, which is using things like facial recognition software to identify Uyghurs and keep them in camps. And it also includes other financial linkages. In January 2019, the then Deputy Secretary of Education testified that almost 70% of colleges that receive Chinese government funding for Confucius Institutes, which are one of the kinds of financial linkages we're pointing out, never reported those contributions to the Department of Education, which is a violation of federal law. Um, 2 years ago, the US Department of Education also reported that between 2013 and 2020, 115 US colleges received almost $1 billion in gifts and contracts from Chinese sources, and that's only what was disclosed. So the
John,
extent of the
people
financial ties
always
here is incredible.
people always want to know, why are you doing this? You're a young guy. You can do anything you want. You can go anywhere you want. You've got background. You're obviously very well spoken on the Chinese Communist Party and the entanglement of companies with the central government and the CCP. Why are you doing this?
Well, I think it's increasingly important now, given that the Chinese government has identified US college campuses as one of its key targets, that people my age, people who are in college or who recently graduated, people who care about uh, the the leadership of U.S. academic institutions, who care about their sort of storied history of cultivating, not just sort of the next generation of leaders, but also some of the leading figures in science and technology. Um, at the end of the day, these institutions have incredible potential to continue to play that role. But if we allow authoritarian governments like the Chinese government, like the Chinese Communist Party, to influence what students can and can't talk about on campus, to, in many cases, monitor and even threaten students' study on U.S. college campuses, to use U.S. college campuses as targets for espionage. All of these things undermine the leadership of U.S. academic institutions, and they undermine the ability of people my age uh, to use those institutions as places where we can cultivate our own leadership. So, you know,
Yeah.
this is it's I think increasingly clear to anyone who's paying attention that this is a government that we can't trust to be a responsible actor on the world stage, and students, I'm glad to say, are waking up to that.
Now, college campuses are soft targets. They really are, because they're always in need of money. They always want endowed professorships, Confucius Institutes. You need someone like Jim Banks in Indiana who said, as surely as night follows day, we will cut off funding to Indiana schools unless you shutter your Confucius Institute, University of Indiana, and they did. But how often do they just simply ignore what China is doing to the Uyghurs? And you might want to also tell the audience what they are doing to the Uyghurs. I've covered it a lot, but there are new listeners. You explain.
Well, so I'll address the second part of that first. The situation for Uyghurs in China is getting worse really by the day. It involves the forced detention of millions of Uyghurs, involves widespread forced sterilization, um, the separation of families, and in many cases, the forced marriage of Uyghur women to Han Chinese men, involves efforts to basically abolish the Uyghur religion and prevent the use of the Uyghur language. So it's really far-reaching, and what is particularly important, I think, for your audience to be aware of is that big business is absolutely complicit in this. Multi-billion-dollar corporations based in the U.S., in China, in Europe, they use Uyghur forced labor. Everything from the screen on an iPhone to the door of a subway car in any of the major cities in the country has the potential to have been produced by Uyghur forced labor. So we're talking about more than cotton and textiles, which are sort of the obvious sort of targets, and that's the industry I think people are most aware of having these ties to Uyghur forced labor, but it does go beyond that.
Last question, John. I want to make sure I get this in. When you put up a card table at the university, which is the traditional way of bringing in students, who stops? Who are you bringing in? Who are you